We are going to spend a little more time in step number 4 of word studies, but before we get there, our first 3 steps is 1, we just open up our English Bible and we look for what? A word that looks significant, and then we look for what after we find a significant English word? A Greek word that lies underneath it. Very good. And then after we find our Greek word, what's our third step? Yeah, we look for the range of meaning. What can this mean in various contexts? And then what we're going to try to figure out is what does it mean in its own context? Now, when we say context, I introduced last time that could be a very small context. You could figure it out from the verse itself, the phrase, the verse, but you might have to expand a couple verses. Or you might have to expand an entire paragraph, or you might have to expand an entire chapter, entire book, to figure out what is the meaning here. And even beyond that, notice that what I have up here is that after you get through how it's used maybe in that book, then you might want to figure out how does that author use it in all of his books? And is there anything for a specific circumstance when that book was being written that would change how he was using that word? Because those things happen. We do it all the time as well. And then you have to expand to what does the whole New Testament do with this word? And then beyond that, you would look at how the Bible uses that word or concept. Of course, there are 2 other languages besides Greek that the Bible was written in. What are those 2 languages? Hebrew, Aramaic. And so you're going to be expanding and really getting an overwhelming amount of information unless you try to limit kind of what you're looking at. But to do a very exhaustive study, you would have to consider how that word or concept is used throughout. And then also, sometimes it can be helpful to get how it was used in the culture around them to see if there's any similarities or differences to how it's used in the New Testament. I meant to mention last time, and I think it's available free online, but Lo and Nita, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing their names exactly right, but I think you can find that online for free. And their lexicon, it's something weird like something based on semantic domains or something like that. So, but it's usually known as Lo and Nita. And what's really nice about doing word studies with Lo and Nita at your disposal is that what they'll do is they will group like words, even if they're not the same root. So if you find they might have an entry on king, but then in the same semantic domain, they might have Christ as Messiah. And so they have kingship words, lordship words, maybe all grouped together. Whenever I was doing a study, I preached on it several months ago on shame. I looked up what Lo and Nita did, and you find every word that's associated with shame in the New Testament. And so that's a helpful resource, and I think it's free online. That being said, what I don't get into a lot here in just the bare bones word study is that if you really want to do a good word study, you would not only look up the word itself, but you're going to look up all the synonyms as well. And so you're trying to get a full picture. And really, this is where sometimes the jargon gets a little confusing, but whenever you hear people talk about a theology of something, in essence what they're doing is they're getting all the whole concept and they are presenting that. What we would probably call that is a doctrine of something. And then outside in the evangelical and Protestant and Catholic world, they might call that the theology of something. So if you ever see that phrase, what they're basically doing is they're grouping all of this research on a certain concept and calling it, this is the theology of rest, or this is the theology of lordship, or something along those lines. All right. So then what I suggest here at the bottom is the closer the context, the more important it is. I can find a very obscure reference in Josephus to a certain word, but that may inform me in no way regarding what I want to see in this exact context. And so what I would suggest is if you have verse, paragraph, book by the same author, New Testament Bible, non-biblical sources, you go only as far out as you need to find out what it means. You don't have to go all the way to non-biblical sources to figure out what Lord means in Romans chapter 10. And so you just go as far as you need to. Now, it may be that you're wanting to make an exhaustive study of something. Maybe you want to develop a topical series for a Bible class or something, and you really want to investigate lordship in the entire Bible. That's going to be a very long study and a whole lot of individual studies. But if you just want to figure out what it means in its exact context of, for instance, Romans 10, you may only have to go to the paragraph to figure out what he means there. All right, any questions about that? All right, so let's use that example of Romans chapter 10 and verse 9. And we saw that the English word there is Lord. That's consistent throughout all of the translations. All major English translations use the word Lord for Kyrios. And we found out that Kyrios is what lies underneath the English translation there. And then we have to start figuring out, well, what does it mean? And we saw that the range of meaning is it could just be a respectful term like sir, it could be a master, it could be a God lowercase g, or it could be God uppercase g. Specifically, it could be even translating the name Yahweh from the Old Testament. And so what does Lord mean in Romans chapter 10 and verse 9? Well, we would look in the immediate context. And someone read for us again Romans 10:9.
That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved.
All right. Here's something that is related. Let me put that in. So you have confess, Lord, believe what?
Believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead.
Resurrection. There seems to be some parallels there that, confession is going to be tied to belief in some way, because even later on in the paragraph, doesn't he say, how will they believe on, or how will they call on him whom they have not believed, and how will they believe on him and whom they have not heard? And so there is a link between these. Perhaps there is a link between lordship and resurrection. Now, he's developing different ideas, but even in the immediate verse, we're seeing somehow these concepts are connected. Belief and confession are not completely separate ideas. Lordship and resurrection are not completely separate ideas. And what we find is that even in the whole of the book of Romans, he ties lordship to the resurrection. So that may be something to consider. We look at the immediate verse, and so maybe whatever he means by lordship, maybe it's connected in some way to him being raised from the dead, because that's what you need to believe, that God raised him from the dead, and you need to believe that Jesus is Lord. All right? Now we step out from the verse itself, and what we find is that if you drop down a couple of verses, someone read for us verses 12 and 13.
There is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord over all is rich to all who call upon him. For whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved.
All right, so in this paragraph, who is the Lord we're talking about? Who are we confessing as Lord? We're confessing Jesus as Lord. Now he quotes an Old Testament prophecy. What does he quote? Joel 2 and verse 32. Now here's where we get in. We don't have time to develop it, but we go to our Hebrew interlinear, and we go back to Joel chapter 2 and verse 32 in our English Bibles. I think it's maybe in chapter 3 in the Hebrew Bible. Regardless, they divide their chapters and verses up a little bit different sometimes. But you have Joel 2 and verse 32, and what you find when you look at the word Lord there is that it is Yahweh. So, in that immediate context, he is saying calling on Yahweh is equivalent to calling on whom? Jesus. So, I think what we could even say is Paul has already in the paragraph shown us what kind of lordship he's talking about here. It's not just a master, but he is using the translation of the name Yahweh and tying it directly to Jesus. But if we wanted to expand beyond that, what we could do is go to the whole book, and what we find is that in Romans chapter 1 and verse 4, Jesus was declared to be what? Son of God by what? The resurrection from the dead, and through the Spirit of holiness, and so on and so forth. And you have this concept of Son of God connected to the resurrection of Jesus, which we saw resurrection connected to lordship in the immediate context. It's a whole nother study, but it is interesting to track through how that concept of Son of God is applied to Jesus. And I think it has overtones of him being both king and him also being God. And we don't have time to develop that, but already the concept of Son of God in the Old Testament was connected to kingship, but was also connected to kind of divine as well. And we see that Jesus is a unique Son of God, different than others, according to the Gospel of John. So we're kind of stepping out there. And I'm not going to go through those other passages, but if you look at how Lord is used throughout the book of Romans, it's often connected to Jesus, and it's often connected to his deity, his exalted status. And if we step out from there to the same author, I'll come back to 1 Corinthians chapter 8, but in Philippians chapter 2, Jesus, before he came as a man, was in the form of God. Then he came in the form of, here's a tricky one, slave, servant. And then, what did God do to him? It doesn't use the word form again. Highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. That's quotation, or at least a very close allusion to Isaiah 45, where he uses the name Yahweh. Lord is the name. And he gives that name. So it's that he goes back to the form that he had before. He took the form of a slave. So all authority, no authority, and I'm using that accommodatively, is that he submitted all of his authority to whatever the Father wanted. And then he was highly exalted so that he is now authority over all again. And so even there, in Philippians chapter 2, we're seeing connections to Yahweh, Lord of the Old Testament, Jesus having that form, taking the form of a slave in the likeness of man, and then being highly exalted by God the Father. Still submission to the Father, but at the same time, there's a highly exalted name above every name. And then, has anyone ever seen this word? Shema. Jews still do this today. The Shema means hear. The Shema is a prayer that they do. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And the Shema there is Deuteronomy chapter 6. What's interesting, and I don't have time to develop it, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 5 and 6, Paul looks at the Shema, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and he interprets that in light of Jesus, so that now you have one God, who is the Father, and one Lord, who is Jesus, so that he can still have that the Lord is one concept, but he's applying the name God to God the Father, and he's applying the name Lord to Jesus. And so you have the, not the full Trinity mentioned there, but you have two members of the Godhead who are taking on that Shema, that Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one idea. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 8, now you have connections by Paul as well to Jesus being the same Lord who was Lord in the Old Testament. Are we seeing some kind of a track record of Paul that he likes to apply Yahweh language to Jesus? Might that inform how we read Romans chapter 10? Maybe. And then we could look at several other places that this is not unique to Paul. The New Testament does it as well. Mark chapter 1. Mark is sometimes viewed, I'm not sure if I totally buy into it, but a lot of people believe Mark was the first gospel written. Um, it's interesting that the quote unquote church fathers actually thought Matthew was written first and that Mark is an abbreviation of Matthew, and they're a lot closer to it than we are. But there's a lot of good arguments out there for why Mark may have been the first gospel. And what's interesting is that in Mark chapter 1, verses 1 through 8, you have the story of John the Baptist. He says this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of Jesus, the Son of God. Then he quotes Isaiah's prophecy and says that he is to go and prepare the way for the Lord. Now, in Isaiah, that's referring to prepare the way for Yahweh. Then who does John the Baptist prepare the way for? Jesus. And so you have a divine connection, even in that quotation of Isaiah, that he's preparing the way for Jesus, who is Lord, Yahweh. Might add to that the very next chapter, you have probably the most explicit mark and reference to the deity of Jesus. He forgives sins. Who can do that except God alone? And John chapter 20 and verse 28, my Lord and my God. And then, I really like thinking through the deity of Jesus. I think it's something that we just assume a lot of times, maybe not develop. But I'm going to at the young adult class this Sunday, so get ready for that. But Matthew chapter 1 and verse 21, you shall call his name Jesus. And then in Greek, for he himself will save the people from their sins. What does Jesus mean? Yahweh saves. Who's going to be doing the saving? He himself. It has the emphatic pronoun there. He himself will save the people from his sin. Who's Jesus? He's Yahweh. He is the Lord. So whenever you hear news reports that say it is a later church invention, Jesus and the early Christians never assumed that Jesus was God. They did something even more peculiar. They used the very name of God with Jesus. They definitely upheld the deity of Jesus in the first century. And then I won't go into non-biblical sources. So notice there that I did actually give you a truncated version, because what you would have had to do is read that whole paragraph for yourself and see if there's any connections to what lordship means. Then you would have had to go back and read maybe Romans chapters 9 through 11 and see if there's any connections, which interestingly enough, there's a direct reference to Jesus being God in, I think, chapter 9. And then also, you'd have to read the whole book and see what it says about lordship. And then you'd have to read all of Paul's writings. And you'd have to keep going out from there if you needed to. But didn't we already see? Even if someone said in that verse, it's just talking about him being master because he was raised from the dead and exalted and given a name that is above every other. But what about the very next couple of verses where he is connected to Yahweh, the one who they need to call upon? It's right there in the text that Lord is referencing his deity, not just his authority, if you will. Any questions about that? So do you kind of see how if you find a significant word, it is going to take a lot of work to do a good job with a word study, but the fruits are that not only does it kind of demolish false teaching like Jehovah's Witnesses who don't believe that he is Yahweh, but not only for fighting false teaching, but now we know better who Jesus is by taking a look at that concept of lordship. And it's going to inspire us to serve him as our God, our master. Now, what I would suggest is that if we are confessing that Jesus is Lord in all caps, that does not preclude the fact that they did use the name Lord for a reason, because God is master with a capital M. And so it's not taking away from the authority, it's just going beyond authority to prove deity as well. There's a couple of things I want to go through. I said that as we go through these kinds of word studies and we start finding all this information, all this data that we're trying to consolidate and figure out what does this mean, there are some common mistakes that we need to avoid as we do word studies. And I want to look at a couple of them. And I'm going to use some big words because those are the words that a lot of people who teach on hermeneutics use. But I don't want you to memorize the big words. I just want you to memorize what the problem is and how to fix that problem. So the first one is anachronism. Anyone know what an anachronism is? Yeah, you're taking something out of time. In essence, what you're doing is you're saying, well, it meant this 300 years before the New Testament. It must mean that in the New Testament. Or it was used this way 200 years after the New Testament. It must be that the seed was already there in the New Testament. Well, a couple of clear examples is that in the church fathers, so-called, they began to use bishop of the exalted elder who is above all the other elders. Is that inherent in the New Testament word? No. And yet someone could say, well, that's what it meant in the New Testament. That's why their doctrine changed. Their use of the word changed, not the word itself in the New Testament. And so we have to be careful not to kind of push things. For instance, earlier in Greek, kind of classical Greek, the word kephali means head, could also mean source. And so some feminist scholars have taken 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 3 to say that man is not the authority over woman, but he is merely the source of woman. But that's an anachronism. They're using an older definition that isn't even in the context, so they're actually doing a couple of fallacies here. But they're trying to push their own view. They're pushing something into the text that wasn't there. And so we have to be careful not to do that. Another example might be psallo, closely related to psalmos, psalm, but it's to make melody is how it's usually translated. I really don't have a problem with someone saying it's to pluck as with an instrument because the instrument is specified in Ephesians 5:19. But what I do think is a danger is say, look, it meant an instrument hundreds of years before, therefore it must mean an instrument in the New Testament. Well, it didn't, because when it's used without an object, it's just translated sing praises. And so we have to be careful not to force earlier meanings on the New Testament. Martis. Let me spell that in English letters. A martyr. Now, a martis in the New Testament probably did not mean, at least with the possible exception of Revelation, probably did not mean someone who is ready to die for their faith or someone who died for their faith. This simply meant a witness. A witness. In fact, your word for testimony is related to this word martis. And so it's just the idea of evidence given or someone who is giving evidence, someone who is a witness. But what's interesting is that it's possible that you even see some changes in the word by the time you get to Revelation 2 because you have a faithful witness who does die for his faith. And so you have to, but that doesn't mean that when it talks about witnesses earlier in the New Testament times, that it had to be someone who was dying for their faith. That was probably not part of the word. And it probably wasn't even part of the word in Revelation 2, but it was moving in that direction so that it started to be used that way. Here's a fun anachronism. Romans 1:16. For the gospel is the dynamis. What does that look like? Dynamite. I don't know how many times I've seen writings that say, look, this is God's dynamite. And I understand what some of them are trying to do, but some of them keep on building it and say, it's explosive, it's powerful. That's not what dynamis meant in the New Testament. It had nothing to do with explosive power that you see with the word dynamite, as it was borrowed from the Greek language long afterwards. So don't take a modern use and apply it backwards. For instance, aravon in Ephesians chapter 1 and verse 14. in modern Greek has come to mean a wedding ring, but it is the guarantee. The Holy Spirit is the guarantee. So it's changed to mean, which you can see some similarity to a guarantee, but that's not what it meant in the New Testament. So don't take a modern usage and force it back into the ancient usage. And I think you can already see just from some of these examples how it can be dangerous to start taking older meanings or newer meanings and forcing them into the New Testament. We're making it say something that it didn't necessarily say. The next one is the etymological fallacy. What is etymology? The study of the origin of words. We should not assume that etymology determines meaning. Sometimes it can, but not necessarily. Here's one of my favorites. And I do have it on there. So, well, I'll come to it in just a second, but I'll go ahead and write it. Spell it out in English. How it's usually spelled. How does it? There. Let's see. But let me go back to 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 4. It's been argued that the hyperetes, it's a word that kind of blends words for the under rower. And so there have been commentators who said that the servant, the hyperetes, is like that rower at the bottom of the boat. So he's at the very bottom. Well, that's probably, even if the etymology is under rower, that it probably never necessarily meant that exactly. But you're saying, well, because you have these two words that got put together, it must have that meaning. That's not necessarily true. It's kind of like the English word butterfly. Is it because there was some picture of butter and flying? Unlikely, but somehow that word came together in that way. There's probably a better example out there. But here's one, ecclesia. Have you ever heard someone say, the church is the called out? Because out, ecclesia is related to the word for call. It is doubtful that this, at least by the New Testament times, or probably ever, actually carries the idea of the called out. At least by New Testament times, it just meant an assembly, a congregation. And it's doubtful, at least as far as I understand, there's very little evidence that you can trace it back and say that they were called out to an assembly. It's that they just became an ecclesia when they were there. You can study that out on your own, but it's probably, when you see the word ecclesia, don't necessarily think that that just means Jesus is going to build his called out people. No, he's going to build his congregation. He's going to build his assembly. Selective use of the evidence. This is where we only use the verses or the word studies that make the point we want it to make. We should not do that. We should look at all the evidence, even when it challenges what we think. Those are the three big ones. Does anybody have any questions about those? How could you put a check on yourself not to do these things when you're doing a word study?
Well, for one, you could see if other people have come to the same conclusion that you have.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an absolute guarantee, but that's one check.
Right. Very good. What?
Bounce it off somebody else, especially that third one. I think that one is very easy to slip into, and you can talk to somebody you trust, and think a lot of, admire for their knowledge of the Bible, and say, am I using this wrong? Am I putting too much in this?
Right. Trevor?
I was going to say that for the last one, you have to look at all the examples.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can't just look at one or two of them that says what I want, and then go. You've got to exhaust it. You got to look at all the evidence. The other two are basically check boxes. Like, you need to look at each of the lexicons and see which era they were targeting.
Mm-hmm.
If they tell you they're targeting classical Greek, then
right.
you know you're at a huge
Right.
And then the other one, just the etymology, you gotta know not to do it.
Right. Right. Now, it can be helpful to look at etymology, but don't determine your meaning purely from etymology. That's all I'm saying with that one is whenever your point is totally based on the etymology of the word and no lexicon is making that point, be careful with that. All right. One more slide here. Not cavemen. Now, understand that I don't believe there was any prehistoric man out there. I use cavemen accommodatively. In the way that we sometimes think of it is almost like the Tarzan speech, me Tarzan, you Jane. We have to focus on larger units. Take the whole phrase, take the whole sentence, take the whole paragraph, because we normally do not communicate in single word units. And in fact, it becomes more confusing the simpler we try to make it. Some things can be easily communicated with one or two words and leaving out verbs and things like that. But if you're trying to communicate complex ideas and you leave out major portions and kind of cavemanish, it leaves a lot of room for ambiguity, which would, and for confusion. And so what I'm trying to say here is, as we do word studies, don't just think that they were talking like cavemen where they were this word plus this word plus this word. They're taking a whole concept and they're linking it together in same way we put a phrase together. We don't just build a phrase purely from meaning A, meaning B, meaning C. What we sometimes do, that would throw away all idioms, because idioms have a total meaning without just individual parts being put together. So the danger of doing word studies is that we can begin to find or instill the total meaning of a word in itself and not in the context. For instance, the meaning agape, the word for love. This is how it's sometimes done. Someone does a word study and selective use of the evidence. They say love, agape is unselfish, unconditional love. Now, would we hope that Christian love would kind of be like that? Yes, but that doesn't mean every time we see the word, it means that. And for instance, and I think Stephen's probably brought this up in the past, so I'll just hit it quickly. But John 3:16 uses the verb form of agape. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only, one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." Someone read for us 2 Peter 2 and verse 15. 2 Peter 2:15.
Forsaking the right way, they have gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness.
Whew. Was that unselfish, unconditional love? Right. So obviously this is not the same kind of love, even though it's the same word, or at least word family, as John 3:16. Or the verb form is used in the Septuagint in the Old Testament. Does anyone know what 2 Samuel 13:1 is talking about? Oh yeah. Amnon's unselfish, unconditional love for Tamar. That's the word. Now, what we do have to be careful of is that the Septuagint was written a couple hundred years before the time of the New Testament, but that we see the same concepts being used in in selfish and conditional types of love in the New Testament shows us that the word meaning was general enough, wide enough range that it can include the love of God just as it could include the love of Amnon. So what that tells us is that agape is not a special word in and of itself, because we use the word love for all those different loves. That's what they were doing the very same thing with. And so it's not just, again, the base there. You have to look at all the various uses, see how it's being used in its specific context. And it seems like there was one other thought I had on that, and it's escaping me. So I'll let it lay there. Does anybody have any comments or questions about that? All right. You got an assignment. So we have, for the classes I'll be here, we'll have 2 classes left. Next time, you all will report on a word study. Here's what I'd like you to do. For the next class, I'd like you to pick a word and go through these steps. Now, the Blue Letter Bible is going to be helpful because you're going to pick a word. Let's say, for example, maybe someone wants to do this. I can't remember if I'm spelling this right in transliteration. Splunknon. It's a fun word. So it's related to the word mercy. It's that bowels of mercy type idea. You also have a verb form of that. That every time you see, and this is actually, if I remember right, an onomatopoeia kind of sounds like what it is. It's guts. And so splunknon, splunknizome. It's kind of a fun word. But, if you looked up agape, you're going to be tracking down verses for a very long time. You find a word that's used a lot less, but has a similar meaning of mercy, compassion, then it limits how far you're going to have to go. But regardless, pick a word that you've wanted to study. I would not suggest something like Kai, or even Christos. Important words, but maybe not in the next 3 days. So pick a word that you can figure out. So pick an English word. Then use your Blue Letter Bible to find out what word lies underneath that. Then I want you to grab a dictionary, maybe the one on Blue Letter Bible. They usually give a pretty good overview of the possible meanings. And after you've picked your word, you need to pick a specific text that you want to find out the meaning in that specific text. Because I want you to be able to interpret in the particular text, because if it's just the word, you're going to have 50 contexts. But if you have one verse with that word, you have one context that you can then build out to all those others as you need to. You're going to have 2 minutes. For those who are willing to verbalize, you have 2 minutes to summarize what you found. If you are uncomfortable verbalizing, then bring me a paper or email it to me, and I'll kind of summarize if you want me to for you. But I would prefer if you're willing to just quickly summarize what you found whenever you found your text, found your English word, what word was underneath it, what that word can mean, and then what it means in your text and how you got to that meaning with your 4th step of all those other steps. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like you to be able to show that you used your interlinear in order to get to a meaning in a particular context. If you need any help over the next couple of days, feel free to call or email me, and I'll try to help out as I can. But make this as simple on yourself as you can. You don't have to go crazy. And I mean, it would be amazing to find out, for instance, propitiation is a very beautiful word, but that's also even though there's fewer occurrences in the New Testament, it's a very deep word, and you're going to have to move from the Greek New Testament all the way to the Old Testament to figure out everything. So do what you can with knowing your schedule and knowing what you have to do before Sunday. Just complete it so that you run through it by yourself, so that I'm not just up here saying, well, look at this in this paragraph, look at this, this, this. Find it for yourself, and then report on it next time. Since we have less than 20 students, I think, we should, if we move along quickly and everybody keeps that 2-minute limit, then we should be able to complete that. In fact, if I get really creative, I may even have a 2-minute timer on the screen so that everybody knows how much time they have. Thank you, everybody.